to the Myrna Method live stream. I'm registered Dietitian Myrna. In this video, you don't want to swipe away. You want to watch the whole thing because this video is absolutely critical if you think the new food recommendations are going to make your life better. In fact, I'm going to show in this video biochemically, because that's all we should be concerned about. I don't care about the politics. The only thing I care about is that it makes scientific sense. And from a registered dietitian, based on these recommendations, because we're the ones that have to take the recommendations and do meal planning for very sick people. That's what we do. You can't use these recommendations. The numbers don't match. But most importantly, I'm going to give you the one thing that they didn't mention, and I looked through the 300 or 298 studies, and not one mention of a major factor that determines if you're going to get type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, dementia, obesity. These are the metabolic diseases. There's one factor that they don't mention that is the turning point for you not getting these diseases that has 100% to do with the foods you eat. In other words, you get the food right and you can reverse these diseases. You get the food wrong and it's going to cause the disease. So something that important, it seems like you would want to know about it. So Sammy, if you're ready, let's get started. So the new pyramid. Now, first of all, RFK didn't do this himself, okay? He had advisories that advised him. And they are the ones that pretty much come up with what we should eat and why we should. Now, I did a previous video on beef tallow if you're interested, but that's not really related to this video. But I just thought I'd mention it because it does relate to RFK and some of his recommendations. So let's look at the new recommendations, and they put it in picture form. And I'm not really sure, well, as a dietitian, it's a joke. We go to school for 6 years. We get a master's degree to totally understand what nutrition is all about because we have to use these recommendations that they give us to treat people. And this is untreatable. I can't treat people with it. So in this recommendation, what they talked about was this pyramid, which we're going to go over. They talked about eating real food, keeping the saturated fat under 10%, which, by the way, if you follow this, the saturated fat won't be under 10%. Why is that? Because I ran the numbers. And we'll talk about the numbers I ran, and I'm going to teach you how to run the numbers so you can be a lot smarter than what our government's presenting us. Eat whole foods, no added sugar. All of that I'm in total agreement with. The problem is that is not necessarily what they're recommending. Let me give you more insight. When I take the pyramid and I separate it out, you can see that a majority of it's going to be high-fat foods, high fat and dairy. You've got your nuts, you've got your avocados, your butters, your meat, your cheeses. So in this particular recommendation, as a dietitian, you have to put it into macronutrients. That's the big elephant in the room they're missing, and this is where you're going to make a difference on whether you get these metabolic diseases or you don't. So I'm going to explain to you how to do diet correctly. Now, not entirely, but I'm going to give you enough information that I think it will greatly impact your life, and it'll give you some real insight into their recommendations, and if it'll work. And what I mean work is that we're supposed to be eating to create health, to create energy, to actually reverse the number one killers in our country, which are the metabolic diseases. That's the whole idea of eating a diet that's going to help bring us more health, not take us down the path of less health. Now, where do these percentages come out? 25% protein. This is if you run the numbers. What does that mean to run the numbers? So as a dietitian, I have to figure out, based on the meal plans that they have given on this pyramid, what do those meals look like? And then what are the macronutrients in those meals? Because the macronutrients, again, are going to be the truth slayer when it comes to nutrition. Well, in their particular pyramid or their recommendation, they want protein at 25%, which, by the way, I'm all about that. That's a good percentage. They want the fat at 50% and the carbs at 25%. And most of the meal planning does not get the fiber above 30 grams. So if I look at the old pyramid and the My Plate, how do the percentages come out there? Protein was about 20%. So if a protein is anywhere from 20 to 25%, as a dietitian, I want to make sure that my patients get enough protein. So clearly, I'm okay with a little more protein. But here's where the biggest change is. They have flipped the fat and carbohydrates, and the fiber also is not enough. Now, I'm going to tell you as a dietitian, I've never seen a healthy gut with less than 30 grams of fiber. Now, I know that they recommend anywhere from 25, nothing less than 25, but I'm a practicing RD, which means that I see patients, I see their laboratory values, and my job is to improve their life through diet. And I just don't see a healthy gut with a low fiber diet. Don't see it. Also, it's going to depend on the variety of those fibers, which they're not including the grains to give enough variety to create this healthy gut. So let's look at the comparison, and then we're going to get into some meals, and I'm going to actually show you visuals. So when I look at the old pyramid, you can see that it's 20% protein on average, and it's really anywhere from 25 to 35% fat. They give you ranges, and we're all comfortable with ranges. Carbohydrates on the old was anywhere from 45 to 55%. And a lot of people say, well, don't carbohydrates cause type 2 diabetes? Well, I'm going to show you the science behind that. I'm going to blow your mind with what I show you on the true biochemistry and why flipping these, taking the fat and reversing it, bringing it up to 50 and bringing the carbs where the fat should be, this is going to be a real loaded gun. And I mean that when it comes to your health. Let's look at particular foods to see their percentages. When I look at nuts, and everybody thinks of nuts as being a protein food, but clearly nuts are not. 75% of the calories from nuts are coming from fat. Now remember, when you look at the pyramid and you take avocados, which are 75% fat, and you take the nuts, which are 75% fat, and you take the whole milk, which is going to be 30% fats, when you start looking at all these fats that they're saying are okay, which, by the way, cheese is another 75% fat. So when you take a slice of cheese, only about 10% of that is protein, and you're going to get 75% fat, just like you're going to do with nuts and avocados. And so when you start throwing in some of those high-fat foods with some of the others that maybe aren't so much fat, you're still going to come out with about a 50% recommendation for fat. So when we look at our percentages of food, and we see that when you start loading up some of these foods, it changes the dynamics of the calories and the percentages. And it's going to be these percentages as a dietitian that I know if I can get these percentages right, I can reverse type 2 diabetes. And you heard me say that correctly. I said reverse type 2 diabetes. I can bring that A1C down within 3 or 4 months of getting these macros correct. But not with these recommendations. So let's go through some food examples so you get a clearer picture. Now, in these 2 plates of food, this is going to be approximately 22% protein, 52% fat, 25% carbs, 8 grams of protein. With the old pyramid, it would have made the cut, mainly because it had way too much fat on the plate. But with the new pyramid, this is going to be within the recommended guidelines. So let's look at a plate of food that would have fit more in the old pyramid, and let's see what happens when we change the fat, because we change the percentages. So this plate of food with just quinoa, you've got some shrimp on it, you got greens. This is approximately 30% protein, 13% fat, 56% carbs. But when I add 2 tablespoons of olive oil, because it has more calories, it changes the dynamics. It changes the percentage. So basically, how you add macronutrients in your food changes the overall percentage. Now, all I want you to know, as a dietitian, I know to reverse these metabolic diseases, I have to really look at these macronutrients. So if I follow their pyramid and what they're saying, and I try to meet their percentages, and it means that I'm going to be adding more fat to the plate, even if it's healthy fat, it changes the dynamics. When you change the dynamics of the macronutrients, you change the outcome of disease. This is what they're not explaining. If I look at this plate of food, perfect example, edamame, we've got beans, we've got corn, a little bit of chicken, and just a few almonds. But just by adding a half a cup of nuts, which on their program would be okay, I change the percentages. It now becomes 42%, 37% carbs. In other words, how these macronutrients are put in meals can disrupt the overall balance of the meal. So without getting real technical, I'm going to do one more plate of food, and then I'm going to get into the science why flipping the carbs with the fat is going to cause a mayhem in your metabolism. Let's go first, before I move on to the science, I'm going to show you a plate of food with the same amount of nutrition in the food, but the percentages will change when I go from a grilled chicken to a fried chicken. Same amount of food. I have 32 grams of protein and 32 grams of protein. I have 10 grams of fat because I didn't fry the chicken. And over here, I have literally 40 grams of fat. So the nutrition is the same on the plate. I want you to get that in your head. But what's changed is the percentages when I added the fat. And according to the new pyramid, this would be more in line with the recommendation compared to the old pyramid. Now listen, in the old pyramid, we never advocated junk food or added sugars or processed food. There's nowhere in there that is mentioned. What we were recommending is to bring more carbohydrates percentage-wise from whole food sources, making sure that they come from high fiber sources. So if we're looking at the percentages, we can't really do that from a dietitian standpoint. I use the percentages, but I change them into the grams that my patient needs. This is where I change lives. When I can tell my patient, by the way, you need 100 grams of protein a day, you need a certain amount of grams of fiber, a certain amount of grams of carbs, and a certain amount of grams of fat. And when you look at food labels, it works out great because food labels give it to you in grams. So if my patient knows that they need 50 grams of fat, and this is 16 grams of fat, they can pretty much know that the food they're eating are either going to make the cut or not. But I don't want to get real technical with you because they don't even give you this information to be able to make those calculated estimations. So they don't really give you enough information to really reverse some of these diseases. But with the information they do give you, I think what's going to happen is people are not, once again, going to understand how to make food work to change their lives in a positive way. Now, I'm going to come back to the daily requirements of these, but first I'm going to get into the science. So here we go. Here's the science why you can't flip protein, why you can't flip the carbs and the fat. So let's talk about the biochemistry, how it all works when you actually eat food. So every time you eat a carbohydrate, it breaks down to glucose. Now, if you drink a big glass of lemonade, that's going to end up in your bloodstream in about 5 minutes. Not a good thing. Too much carbs all at one time will release a lot of insulin. And what happens is this insulin and carbohydrates are trying to do two things. get inside muscles and get inside the brain, because the brain and muscles, they both need sugar. And here's how it works. As soon as you eat that sugar, carbohydrate, you will also release insulin. And the goal of insulin is to go to a receptor site that sits on a muscle cell, receptor sites that sit on certain brain cells, because once insulin attaches to a receptor site on the muscle cell, it talks to a messenger who talks to another messenger and allows the transporter to the surface of the cell, not only in the muscle, but also in certain brain cells. So insulin is the key that allows the transporter to open up the membrane of the cell and let sugar into the muscle cell, which is a beautiful thing, because every time you get a gram of sugar in a muscle, it's going to combine with 3 grams of water. This is called cellular hydration, and why carbohydrates are called carbo, fuel, hydrate, water. So when you get the right amount of carbohydrates in your body, you allow your muscles to hydrate. What happens is that this is disrupted. Because let me mention one thing. If you eat a diet of protein and fiber when you eat the carbs, you slow down the glucose into the bloodstream, and you actually can control the amount of insulin in the blood. So it's about understanding how carbohydrates, fibers, and proteins work in synergy in the meal, which they don't really discuss this. They don't discuss how eating a balanced diet means understanding how the macronutrients work. When you eat carbohydrates and they break down into glucose and the insulin attaches to the muscle cell on the receptor site on the muscle cell and allows the transporter to the surface, the glucose goes inside the muscle, hydrates the muscle. Here's what happens when we eat too much dietary fat. When you eat an excess amount of dietary fat, you release a lot of fatty acids. It happens in 2 situations. If you're too fat, you can release a lot of fatty acids into circulation, or if you just eat too much dietary fat. The recommendation for dietary fat, if you don't want this to happen, is anywhere from 25 to 35% of your daily value of fat. They're recommending 50%. What happens when you have a lot of excess fatty acids in circulation? They accumulate in places they shouldn't, like muscle cells, non-fat tissue. And these excess fatty acids begin to accumulate in non-adipose, non-fat tissue, and they differentiate, which means they change into a type of fat called a ceramide, and this clogs the receptor site. It disables insulin from getting the message to the cell to allow the transporter to let sugar inside. It happens in muscle cells and it happens in brain cells. When it happens in muscle cells, we call this insulin resistant, because maybe you only have a few that are getting clogged. But all you have to do is just keep eating the way you're eating, these high-fat diets, and soon you will have type 2 diabetes. That's right. This is how absurd this is excess fatty acids are the root cause of type 2 diabetes and type 3 diabetes, which is also known as Alzheimer's. Now, here's where it gets confusing, because I absolutely do not believe the government's trying to kill us. Although some people would think they are, I do not believe. I think that they're confused on the biochemistry and how this works. Now, of course, in this video, I'm also going to present studies that support this from the Journal of American Medical Association. And by the way, there's other clinicians that are very much on board, because this is biochemistry. Not my opinion, it's how the body works. But let me explain to you why they get so confused. There is a reason. First of all, let's go back to the example that now muscles no longer able to get the glucose that it really needs, because muscles want glucose. And what happens is this glucose begins to build outside the muscle cell, can't get inside because the receptor site is disabled from too much excess fatty acids, And eventually, this sugar is going to make its way into a fat cell. Fat cells are always open for business. When that happens, you begin to get visceral. You begin to get a belly fat. This is one sign of insulin resistance, is you just start getting a thick midsection. Because most of these sugars that were meant for the muscle are going to go into the midsection. This is where it's going to be deposited mostly. But what happens also, and this is a really interesting concept, and there's one study that was really beautiful, and I'm going to give you that study that identified that insulin resistance and diabetes happens in the fat cell first. In other words, fat cells begin to get corrupt, but different than muscle cells. Fat cells always allow excess because they're big storage containers. But when a fat cell becomes insulin resistant, it then releases more fats into circulation. Think about that a minute. As you get insulin resistance, you not only get it in muscle cells, their receptor sites become disabled. This is type 2 diabetes and the early stages, insulin resistance. It also happens in brain cells, known as type 3 diabetes. And when this happens, there's also an entourage of inflammatory immune cells that begin to cause damage to brain cells. We'll talk about that. Other mediators, we'll talk about those. So bottom line, we're not getting sugar where it's supposed to go, but the fat cells aren't helping out either because they're also insulin resistant. They're also disabled and corrupt. But in this case, they release more fatty acids into circulation, which then begin to accumulate in muscle cells, disabling this, and the circle begins all over again. So here is the mindset. And this is the absurdity with it. And why I'm so excited you're here. Because you're going to be in the know. They are thinking we need to take the sugar out of the blood. And I'm not in disagreement with that, by the way, because excess sugar in the blood is not a good thing either. Because this sugar corrupts a lot of other cells that were not meant to have all this sugar. Because the cells were thinking, well, why isn't the sugar going to the muscle where it belongs? By the way, you're covered in muscle. So if it was working the way it should, sugar should be going into the muscles to give you more energy. So what happens is they start suggesting diets that will remove sugar from the blood, low-carb diets. Now, at first, it works great because when you have a lot of sugar in the blood, and then you do a diet that takes the sugar out of the blood, a low-carb diet, we're going to see immediately positive results in your A1C. We're going to see fasting sugars go down, but you're going to have this crescendo. It's kind of like the wave. What's going to happen, it's going to look really good for a couple of years. That's why studies show, oh my gosh, this is great. But you're still going to be getting corruption in the receptor site. You're still going to be gaining more insulin resistance. Type 2 diabetes. It's just that it's not going to show up. It's like kicking the can down the road. We're going to really see it 5 years from now, and then you're going to have to get on the meds. I also want to mention, if you lose a lot of weight, think about this a minute, think about it. You lose a lot of weight, you're losing a lot of fat cells. As soon as you lose a lot of fat cells, even if you have corruption, initially, we're going to see a beautiful laboratory value because you got rid of a lot of fat cells. You got rid of a lot of circulating fatty acids. But eventually, wait for it because you're kicking the can down the road until you understand how to change your diet. The recommendations they're giving, I do not understand why they don't understand that this is scientific. This is what the root cause of the disease is, and just temporarily reducing the sugars from the blood does not mean we're going to reverse the disease. You got to learn how to eat the macronutrients in the right composite. Okay, that's key. Now, here's the part that's the most disturbing. And I didn't see one study that really talked about the macronutrients. I didn't see one study that talked about lipid toxicity. And this is a thing, by the way. Lipid toxicity is what starts the metabolic diseases. What is lipid toxicity? Excess fatty acids in circulation. And where do you get those? From eating a lot of excess fats, even healthy fats, if you're not at the right percentages, okay? The body is based on a system of balance as a yin and a yang. You can't just decide that you're going to change things. The body doesn't work that way. A lot of these excess dietary fats release more fatty acids than what your body should have, and this can lead to this lipid toxicity. This is what starts insulin resistance because it starts in the fat cell, and then the fat cells become insulin resistant, and they become even better at releasing more fatty acids in circulation. And this contributes to a type of fat called a ceramide. And nowhere did I see anything on ceramides. Ceramides are very disturbing because ceramides themselves can cause atherosclerosis. They can actually cause plaque in the arteries. They're independent of even the fats that you're eating. And they're not measuring ceramides, not yet. But I did see that the Mayo Clinic and Quest Labs were considering it because of the research and the association of ceramides with type 2 diabetes. Surprise, surprise. Also, the association of ceramides with heart disease. Ceramides have been known to cause valve stenosis. They've been known to cause kidney dysfunction. They contribute to type 1 adult onset diabetes, and also ceramides. And this is the crazy part. They are also responsible, we're seeing, in creating amyloid plaques, these actual fats. So no wonder Mayo Clinic and some of these other, Quest Labs are looking into this because they're seeing the research. And I'm going to talk about Dr. Summers, one of the leading scientists. He teaches at the Utah Medical University, and he really has been profound on what he's done in bringing to light some of these fats. Okay, now I do want to mention something that every time you exercise, and this to me is wonderful in some ways, but can be misleading in other ways. Every time you exercise, your body brings transporters to the surface of muscle cells. Even if you're highly insulin resistant, even if you're a diabetic and you got 80% of these guys all clogged up and you got an A1C of 8.8, of course you're on medications, but if you're exercising, these transporters come right to the surface of that muscle cell. It's like the muscle says, look, I need sugar right away. And when that happens, every time you exercise, and you have to do it at a good intensity, you can bring sugar into the muscle cell. And that is why exercise is shown with diabetics to reverse. I won't say reverse, but it doesn't reverse the disease, because the only way you can reverse disease is go up here and actually reduce some of these fats. Eat a diet that's going to be conducive to reversing it. But what exercise does is it reduces the sugar in the blood. And by exercising and bringing some of this sugar into the muscle is good news. Sure, we don't want a lot of sugar in the blood. But this is where they're really looking at the disease. They're measuring the disease by deciding the sugar in the blood. And the sugar in the blood is just the end product of the real root cause of the disease. So I say that because with a lot of my patients, and I've talked about this on several podcasts, I show athletes that come in to see me with an A1C really low. In other words, every time they work out, they shuttle the sugar in the blood. But of course, they're eating a Mediterranean diet, super healthy, a lot of avocados, nuts, pay no attention to macronutrients. They're lean, they look gorgeous. And guess what's happening? I do a 2-hour glucose test on them, and they're full-blown diabetics. And a lot of these athletes, all I have to do is wait for it, because in their late 60s, they're seeing their A1C rise. Because like I said, eventually it's going to show up. And why is that? Because every time they exercise, they're shuttle the sugar into the muscle cell. So it's, really showing that they have low sugar in the blood as they become more and more diabetic. They're releasing more and more ceramides, and they hit this wall. Over 65, it's like, I don't get it. My labs were great. Everything was fine. And it's like I'm falling apart. I'm like, you really aren't just falling apart. This was happening a decade prior. It's just they weren't doing the right tests. You weren't eating the right diet. And now you're seeing the results in the blood. So they didn't really mention anything about these ceramides, or did they talk anything about what I'm mentioning to you now? What they're referring to is, let's get the sugar out of the blood, which, by the way, I'm in agreement with that. But you get the sugar out of the blood by eating the right diet. You don't get the sugar out of the blood while you're blocking more of these receptor sites, contributing to more of the disease. So bottom line, when we look at the two pyramids, now you can understand, as a clinical dietitian trying to treat patients, to reverse. And by the way, as a dietitian, if I didn't give somebody a diet that I couldn't show them a set of labs 12 weeks later, I wouldn't be in business. Okay? I've got to get them on a diet and then show that I can get them off the statins, that I can get them off these diabetes medications. And I can't do that unless the diet is going to be conducive to do that. So the key point I'm trying to make here is that they flipped the fats and carbs. And the reason why they flipped the carbs is because they didn't want a lot of sugar in the blood. And really, what you should be doing when you eat the carbs is you shouldn't be drinking lemonade. Let's go there, or adding sugar, because that sugar is going to go into the bloodstream super fast. That's like, duh. Like, I hate to be, that's probably disrespectful for me to say that, but common sense. If you eat a carbohydrate with fiber, which is why it's called net carbs, it's not like they're really getting rid of the carbs. What they're doing is they're changing the effect of the carbs. When you bring a fiber and you attach it to a carb, there is no way that carb's going into the bloodstream super fast. It can't, because it's got all this fiber attached to it. So it's got to digest it and release it in a much slower pace, which is why fiber is so good for weight loss, because it controls the carbs. So when you take a carbohydrate and you put a lot of fiber on it, that's not what it's going to look like. Not at all in this picture. You're going to have, I'm going to show you visually, once you have that fiber with the carb, all this insulin's not happening at that rate. It's going to change. You're going to get a trickle effect. It's time released, because the body's not going to throw those carbs out super fast. It's going to throw it out a little bit now, a little bit later, which is why adding fiber changes everything. So it's not really the food pyramid. I don't even understand how somebody's going to look at that. What I think is people are going to look at that and they're going to say, wow, this means avocados and nuts and meat and cheese. This is all really great. I'm not saying that that isn't acceptable, but it's at the right percentages. And they don't even talk about it. And not getting the right percentages is total mayhem. So let me give you some information that I think is going to help you, because you're going to say to me, well, how much of these macronutrients do I need? Well, let's talk about protein. You take your current weight and you divide it by 2.2. That's going to put it into kilograms, and you multiply it by 1.2. So we all agree on that. That's going to be at the low end. I tell my patients, please do not let your carbs get too low, or let your proteins get too low, because you need protein to build everything in your body. Now, I was trying to be simple with a lot of my patients, and I was saying, take your current weight, or your current weight, and just cut it in half, which would have given more like a 1.1. But let's just give it to you exactly like they're doing, which I'm in agreement with. Totally. We got to get the right amount of protein. We got to get protein in the body. Absolutely. The carbs, you take your ideal body weight. Not what you weigh now, because you may be a little heavier than what you should. You take your ideal body weight. You multiply it by 1.3. So if your current weight's 200 pounds, but your ideal body weight's 150 pounds, you're going to need approximately 190, 195 carbs. That's what your body would like to have for your muscles to work optimally. There's a reason behind it. I'm not going to talk about that in this video, but I do have videos how muscles work optimally when they get this. And fats, and this is the one I really want you to know, you take your ideal body weight and you divide it by 3. Okay, these were numbers I came up with because I do numbers. When I'm doing meal planning for patients, I cannot reverse the numbers on their laboratory values, because those are all numbers too, right? You get them. Everybody gets lab values. Those are numbers. Well, there's also numbers in food. So here it is, folks. Numbers don't lie. I got to get the numbers right on the plate so that you can get your numbers right on the laboratory values. And with the pyramid that they've given, they've made no reference to this. So as a dietitian, when I had to do my own numbers on what they gave me, couldn't make it work. So I do have a book. I'm going to do a little plug because I think it's worth it. I'm not trying to do an infomercial here, because it costs $2.99 on Kindle. So it's not like I'm getting rich off this book. Why your diets fail and the science that really works. I really talk about this. It's an airplane read. You know what that means? You read it on the airplane, so when you get off to your destination, you now know how to eat. It's got a lot of pictures. I love pictures. But this literally talks about those macronutrients and why it's so critical you understand what they mean every time you put food in your mouth. So let's go through some of the science. These are in PubMed. These are in Journal of American Medical Association. In this particular study, it's called As a Matter of Fat. I love that title. It's kind of cool. This talks about high fat levels that exceed the fat cell capacity, that create this lipid toxicity. It's fat overload that actually cause this cell death that leads to this obesity and diabetes. So in this particular study, it says right there, I'm going to read right from the abstract, excess fatty acid accumulation in non-adipose tissue, which means non-fat tissue, which muscle would qualify, is a hallmark of metabolic disease. What is metabolic disease? Dementia, cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance, obesity. These are metabolic diseases. When elevated lipid levels, which is just fat, exceed the cell's capacity to store or utilize fatty acids, lipid toxicity response happens. And this is the pathogenesis. This is what leads to obesity and diabetes. Let's look at some other studies. Excess accumulation of lipid impairs insulin sensitivity in skeletal muscle. Lipid, again, meaning fat. This particular study discusses how excess fatty acids lead to intramuscular accumulation of fats that downregulate insulin signaling, preventing the movement of the glucose transporter to the cell membrane. And this is what leads to type 2 diabetes. Now, reading this study and me have shown you that picture, that's why I do the picture first, you can now visualize those fatty acids disrupting that insulin receptor site. That transporter doesn't get the message to come to the surface. More studies that back this. In this particular study, the role of adipose tissue, fat tissue, and this is one of the studies I love. It's the San Antonio Metabolism Study. And this study, for me, was really the turning point because they actually did a clinical trial where they looked at, and I loved the method they used. They used insulin clamps. They used everything that I felt was good for a study to be really be a representation of what's going on. And what this study discovered is that it's actually these fat cells that become insulin resistant to start with that start the ball rolling. They also talk about how this fat tissue, when it becomes insulin resistant, it releases pro-inflammatory immune cells along with these fatty acids, and this impairs glucose metabolism, and it also impairs inflammation in the body. What's really amazing to me, and well, patients will say this to me, I get on the diet you're telling me to do, and my inflammation goes down. I find my joints don't ache as much. I find that things that I had inflammatory conditions, that's correct. Because when you solve insulin resistance, you're solving a huge inflammatory disorder. And it happens in fat cells. And it happens because we're not eating the correct macronutrients correctly. And this leads to toxic lipid metabolites in this particular study, ceramides. They're starting to talk about these fats that actually change, these fatty acids that change into these ceramides. And this alters your fat cells, alters what happens in the plasma, overall increases your risk for all these metabolic diseases. In this particular study, it talks about ceramides, the lipid toxic inducers of metabolic disorders. And in this particular study, they talk about the oversupply of fat to tissues, not suited, meaning muscle cells are not suited for fat storage. And this induces cellular dysfunction. I'm reading straight from the study right here. So if you're on YouTube, you can open it up and you can see I'm not talking anything different than this abstract. The point I'm making is that when fats are being stored in muscles, which they don't particularly want to because of an oversupply of these fatty acids, they then create a situation that causes type 2 diabetes, disrupts the insulin signaling, and then downstream leads to these other disease increases. I talked about Dr. Summers from the University of Utah. I have actually contacted him. He has done a lot of work in this. Hats off to him. And what this particularly talks about and what he mentions in a lot of his research papers is that scientists at the university, I'm reading straight from this, University of Utah Health recently discovered that people with high blood levels of ceramides are at least 3 to 4 times as likely to have a stroke or heart attack than those with lower levels of this lipid. So this to me is huge because these ceramides are almost independent biomarkers on their own. Huge culprits for type 2 diabetes, and most people don't even know they have them. I also want to show what Dr. Summers states is that they also discovered that ceramides do not correlate strongly with triglycerides or other traditional measures of cardiovascular disease risk. In other words, when you're eating a low-carb diet, your triglycerides may be low. Okay? Especially you don't have a lot of glucose in the blood. But you can have a high level of ceramides. And we all know. We know people that have heart attacks, have stents, and they don't necessarily have high LDLs. They're on statins. But there can be other circulating fats, and this is what I really want to bring to light, that are very arthrogenic, that it can cause plaque in the arteries separate of what we're used to testing patients for, like the LDL concentrate, LDL-C. In this particular study, again, specifically relating ceramides to Alzheimer's. Ceramides in Alzheimer's disease, a key mediator of neuronal apoptosis, which means death, cell death. That's what apoptosis means. And it's induced by the oxidative stress, the amyloid beta peptides, the accumulation. And what this study brings to light is that this is related to ceramides. And right here, if I read from the abstract, Alzheimer's disease, the most chronic, progressive, neurodegenerative disorder, is characterized by extracellular deposits of these amyloid plaques. Just like the plaque you're getting in your arteries, you're getting these plaques in your brain. But unlike the artery, where we can reverse some of the plaques, when you start getting plaques in your brain, they're not reversible. This is what leads to the dementia. But this study specifically talks about ceramides, the major molecules of sphingolipid metabolism. Sphingolipids are just part of the ceramide family. And lipid second messengers have been associated with Alzheimer progression and the pathology of these beta peptide generation. And enhanced levels of ceramides directly increase these beta plaques. So this is something that with high-fat diets, it's going to really induce more of these, because this is how the chemistry of these macronutrients work. Now, you can go in your browser yourself and you can type, and I just kind of show you a slide here so you can see I kind of did it, and I wanted to show you what you're going to see when you do it. But you can type in PubMed, public medicine. That's going to give you the government's site for research, which I would think they looked at, right? You would think. If you typed in PubMed, even if you just typed in type 3 diabetes, what you're going to get is a slew, probably millions of studies, literally, on Alzheimer's disease is type 3 diabetes. And what is type 3 diabetes? It's type 2 diabetes, but instead of being in the muscle, it happens to be in the brain. The receptor site becomes disabled. Now, I've talked about it in some of my other videos about certain genotypes. For instance, if you have the APO4 genotype, you're even more susceptible to Alzheimer's. It's considered the Alzheimer's gene. And the last thing you want to have is a high-fat diet. 25% of the population have this gene, and holy smokes, they do a diet high in fats. That's a death sentence, because they're going to be more susceptible to Alzheimer's if they have that genetic mutation. So, just to talk a little bit more about the high-fat diet, which I didn't really talk about in relationship to the gut microbiome. When you have a diet high in fat, you disrupt the macros, you disrupt the microbiome in the gut. When you have a high-fat diet, you disrupt this balance of these firmicutes to Bacteroides. And I don't really want to go in depth, because I have in some of my other podcasts, I've talked about the disruption of the gut. When you don't get the macros right? When you're eating a diet high in fat, low in fiber, you're going to see a change. And in this study, it says, this study aimed to identify the changes in the gut microbiome and these metabolic signatures induced by this high-fat diet. Okay, so, and I didn't pull as many studies on that, although I can. You can too. But I think it's interesting that the National Library of Medicine, this is the National Institute of Health, coming straight from the people that are recommending this pyramid, they talk about giving, this is a review, it's clinical significance for clinicians like myself, and they're really explaining how the role of dietary fiber in health promotes disease prevention. A practical guide for clinicians, people like me. Okay, well, obviously I know this, but I'm letting you know that dietary fiber plays a pivotal role. But it's not just the fiber. It's what the fiber is doing in the gut, which comes right back to the gut microbiome. And when you are giving your body a high-fat diet, you alter that. Even if you're eating a lot of fiber, you can alter the gut microbiome. So I feel like I'm really dragging this out. I probably went way longer than you guys are even wanted to listen to. But for me, this is so critical as a dietitian. This is what I'm supposed to be doing. Helping you know how to differentiate all this information on the internet and bring it home to you and something hopefully useful. And again, why your diets fail is because we're missing the big elephant in the room. Protein, fiber, carbs, and fat. Understand that they have a intention, a biochemical intention to be a certain amount. Okay? And this is, to me, what they have totally missed. I can't build, honestly, a healthy diet and the macronutrients recommended based on the pyramid that they have presented. So hopefully this helped. You can join my little membership at myrnamethod.com, and I work with people there and explain how to eat. So Sammy, how are we doing on the chat? Any questions? Okay.
Oh, wait, hold on. Let me pull it up.
Okay.
We have quite a bit.
Okay, awesome.
All right. Pop that out. All right. Here you go.
So do you want to read them to me, or do you want to... Oh, there they are.
Better if you read them.
Okay.
See them?
Yes. Awesome. So why can't doctors get it right? Maybe money? Diet industry? Pharmaceutical companies? It makes me angry. Is totally different than what it's been said over so many years. I don't know. Okay, I really don't. But I can tell you that if I had other dietitians on this platform, I can't believe they're not outraged. I mean, we go to school, okay, 6 years. Most doctors take maybe 1 or 2 hours of nutrition. So, and then we got to go pass an exam. And how are they going to do that exam, by the way? I was just thinking that's a really good question because it's so based on these macronutrients. It doesn't even match the clinicians that are working in hospitals. They're going to have to make sense of this. Good question. Also, I'm shocked that whole grains are now the smallest food group on the pyramid, especially since eating whole grains can be a significant way to meet your fiber needs. Bravo. The problem is people don't understand fiber in whole grains. They'll look at an advertisement, I see it all the time, and it says whole grains. I'm looking at the package, it says whole grains. I look at the fiber grams, and it has less than 1 gram of fiber. It's got 40 grams of carbs and 1 gram of fiber, but they're advertising whole grains. Or I'll see whole wheat bread that doesn't have hardly any fiber. So I think people don't even understand what fiber is and how to look for it and find it, because you can't depend on the food companies. But that's correct. You have to know the right amount of grains, the right amount of vegetables. This is the part that they're not really coming to light on. It's truly disappointing, but not surprising, that these unscientific recommendations backed directly by the Board of Cattlemen Association and Big Dairy. We have been bailing out for over a decade. I know where that's coming from. I'm not going to get political, but it is a fact that most of the advisors were getting paid by, cattlemen and dairy associations. But for me, that's not my job. My job is not to get up here and be political with you. My job as a registered dietitian is to look at the science, put that aside, and assume even if they're getting paid, doesn't mean they can't bring good science. But that is true. I understand. 2.2, the pork counts.
Page 2.
Oh, page 2. Oh, Okay, great. Yeah, thanks, Sammy. I'm a little slow there. The Port Council were instrumental in 3 new recommendations. Oh, the MDs and 3. Okay, 100% conflict of interest. Explain these horrific recommendations will make people drive up healthcare costs. Yes, make people sick and drive. Yes, absolutely. That's why I did this podcast. I wanted to bring you the science, of course. I didn't want to just say, oh, don't do it. It's not good. I mean, what good is that? So, and will cause greater suffering. Yep, absolutely. With the new pyramid bringing carbs down to 25%, it seems like it would be difficult to meet our fiber needs. Amen. It really will be, because a lot of the fiber is going to be in some of these grains, not necessarily, because beans and lentils have also a lot of fiber, but yeah, there's fiber there. With the new pyramid bringing carbs down. Okay, I already did that. Thanks for bringing the science and the studies and the biochemistry. Either one. Listen, guys. To me, my passion comes from really seeing, in being in clinical practice, I'm seeing it work. So if I'm seeing lives change with my patients on their laboratory values, and by the way, Sammy, we're going to start, because I think it's going to be impactful for you, we're going to start bringing patients on. And I'm going to do on some of my podcasts, those that agree, and I'm not going to charge them for my services. So maybe we can start looking at people. We'll talk about that. But I do have patients that I've said, hey, bring me your labs. Let me share them with the world. And let's see what diet really means from laboratory. Let you see what I see when I'm actually treating these patients. To me, that I think would be impactful. But anyways, any other information here, Sammy? You're the one on IT. We got it?
Yep, all good.
Okay, perfect.
Just forget the like and subscribe.
Yeah, like and subscribe. Tell your friends. Let's get them the news so that they can know what you know to make the changes they need to make to be their healthiest. Okay? Till next time.